In the mid-1930s, as the sun of the Empire of Japan burned ever brighter, the Admiralty in Tokyo began to dream of supremacy, not just in Asia, but across the entire Pacific Ocean. The Imperial Japanese Navy, proud and confident after victories in the Russo-Japanese War and its expanding conquests in China, believed it could challenge the United States for control of the Pacific. But deep inside that ambition was an anxiety, a realization that American industry, with its vast resources and shipyards, could one day build faster and stronger than Japan ever could. To defeat such a giant, Japan's admirals concluded they needed a single weapon so powerful, so unstoppable, that it would guarantee victory before America could even react. That weapon would be a battleship beyond imagination. In 1937, under a veil of secrecy, the Navy began the design of a new class of warship, the Yamato. Every aspect of its creation was classified at the highest level. Even many naval officers were not told its full specifications. The project was known internally as Plan A140-F5, and it was conceived with one purpose: to create the most powerful battleship in history, one that could destroy any opponent before they could come within firing range. The Japanese called it the Fortress of the Sea, a ship so massive that it would embody the divine will of the emperor himself. At the naval shipyard in Kure, Hiroshima Prefecture, work began under immense pressure and astonishing secrecy. A vast dry dock was constructed under wooden camouflage to conceal its scale from foreign reconnaissance. Workers were sworn to silence. Aerial photographs were forbidden. Even Japanese civilians living nearby were told only that a new kind of transport ship was being built. In truth, beneath the planks and scaffolding, something monstrous was taking shape. When completed, the Yamato would displace over 72,000 tons, making it by far the heaviest warship ever constructed. Its main battery would consist of 9 460mm or 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted, capable of hurling a 1.5-ton shell more than 25 miles. Its armor belt was 16 inches thick, designed to withstand any shell fired by existing battleships. For Japan, the Yamato was not just a war machine, it was a declaration of destiny. The admirals believed in a doctrine known as the decisive battle theory, the idea that war at sea would be decided by one grand climactic battle between rival fleets, as it had been at Tsushima in 1905. The Yamato would be the sword of that battle, a divine blade forged to cut through any enemy line. It was, quite literally, built to be invincible. Inside the shipyards, engineers faced challenges that pushed Japan's industrial capability to its absolute limit. The armor plates were so thick that Japan had to invent new steel forging techniques. The gun barrels were so large that only a handful of factories could produce them. The ship's power plant, a set of massive steam turbines producing over 150,000 horsepower, was the most advanced ever made in Asia. But with every innovation came sacrifice. Resources were drained from other projects, smaller ships were delayed or canceled altogether. The Navy was betting everything on this one Leviathan. When the keel of Yamato was laid down on November 4, 1937, senior admirals gathered in silence. Some bowed their heads as Shinto priests performed a purification ritual over the massive steel frame. To them, this was not just the birth of a ship, it was the consecration of national will. The ceremony's leader declared, "She will be the guardian of our seas, the shield of the emperor." As the years passed and the war in China deepened, rumors began to spread among Japan's enemies. American intelligence heard whispers of a super battleship, but dismissed them as exaggerations. After all, who could possibly build a ship larger than the United States' own Iowa or North Carolina classes? Few could imagine that Japan had constructed a vessel nearly 40% larger, capable of outgunning anything afloat. When Yamato was finally launched on August 8, 1940, the sight was almost surreal. Workers wept as the steel giant slid into the water for the first time, its bow cutting through the bay like a mountain entering the sea. Its hull was painted imperial gray, and its name, written in brushstrokes of gold, symbolized ancient Japan itself. Yamato was more than a name. It was the poetic word for the Japanese homeland, the very soul of the nation. For a brief moment, the admirals believed they had achieved the impossible. The Yamato represented everything Japan thought it needed to win the war that was coming: size, strength, and divine power. In their minds, it was a ship that could not be defeated, a floating citadel that would terrify the world into submission. But beneath that confidence lay a fatal flaw, one no armor plate could protect against. The world had already changed. While Japan built the ultimate battleship, America was already building the ultimate carrier. The Yamato was born into a new age, one in which the sky, not the sea, would decide who ruled the oceans. In that twilight between two eras, Japan's dream of invincibility set sail, a dream made of steel and faith, destined to meet the full force of reality. Across the Pacific, in Washington, D.C., the news of Japan's massive new battleship reached the halls of the U.S. Navy Department like a thunderclap. American intelligence had only fragments: intercepted shipping manifests, reports of steel shortages, whispers from shipyards in Kure and Nagasaki. But one fact became clear: Japan had built something extraordinary. Analysts estimated its displacement at more than 60,000 tons, maybe more. No one knew for sure. But the question it raised was far more urgent: how would America respond? The U.S. Navy's answer was not to outbuild the Yamato in size, but to outthink it. Instead of chasing the myth of invincibility, America focused on agility, technology, and coordination. The result was a new generation of capital ships, led by the Iowa-class battleships, that embodied a completely different vision of naval warfare. Where Yamato was a floating fortress, Iowa would be a hunter. Design work on the Iowa class began in 1938, driven by two new realities. First, the lessons of naval aviation, learned through years of carrier experimentation, had begun to reshape how admirals viewed the sea. Second, America's war planners knew that any conflict with Japan would stretch across thousands of miles of ocean. The Navy needed ships that could move fast, protect carriers, and strike far. That meant speed, not bulk; radar, not superstition. The Iowa specifications told the story. While it was smaller in displacement than Yamato, at 57,000 tons fully loaded, it could reach 33 knots, nearly 10 knots faster than Japan's giant. That difference wasn't cosmetic, it was transformational. In naval warfare, speed is survival. It meant that an Iowa could dictate the range of battle, close the distance to finish a fight, or disengage before the enemy's guns could draw blood. Under its sleek armor, Iowa carried an innovation that changed everything: the Mark 13 fire control radar and the Ford Mark 1A ballistic computer, a mechanical brain of whirring gears and analog circuits. Together, they allowed Iowa's gunners to track targets beyond visual range, through fog, darkness, or even smoke. Where Japanese gunners aimed by instinct and training, Americans now aimed with mathematics. The system could automatically compute shell trajectory, ship movement, wind speed, and even the Earth's curvature in real time. For the first time in naval history, a battleship could fight with precision rather than guesswork. At the same time, the U.S. Navy shipyards were embracing the power of mass production. In New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk, the lessons of Henry Ford's assembly lines were being applied to warships. While Japan poured its entire national will into building just 2 Yamato-class vessels, America could launch an entire fleet, carriers, destroyers, and cruisers, in the time it took Japan to complete one. The strength of the Iowa was not only in its steel, but in the industry that stood behind it. By 1942, as the Pacific erupted in flames after Pearl Harbor, the first Iowa-class ships were nearing completion. USS Iowa, BB-61, and her sister, New Jersey, were masterpieces of design, bristling with radar arrays, armed with 9 16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 guns, and surrounded by a phalanx of anti-aircraft batteries. Their speed allowed them to escort carriers like Enterprise and Essex, forming the backbone of the new fast task forces that would sweep across the Pacific. In their war rooms, American admirals understood something Japan did not. The battleship was no longer the king of the seas, but it could still serve the new king, the aircraft carrier. The Iowas were not built to duel other behemoths head-to-head, but to protect, coordinate, and amplify carrier power. This was the key difference between American pragmatism and Japanese fatalism. Where Japan saw glory in a single decisive duel, America saw victory in teamwork. To the men who served aboard her, the Iowa was a marvel, a machine that felt alive. Sailors spoke of her acceleration, how she could surge forward like a greyhound when the turbines opened up. Her radar could spot incoming aircraft at 30 miles. Her gunners could adjust fire within seconds, guided by electrical impulses relayed across the ship's hidden computers. Every inch of her represented the union of science and industry, proof that American innovation could match Japanese ambition blow for blow. But even as she prepared for war, the Iowa's existence carried a quiet irony. She had been built in response to Japan's obsession with the Yamato, yet by the time she entered service, the age of the battleship was already ending. Air power had rewritten the rules. The Yamato would go to sea only to meet its death from above, and Iowa would find herself escorting aircraft carriers rather than dueling other titans. The oceans had changed faster than anyone expected. Still, the rivalry between these two giants, one born of pride, the other from reason, would come to define an era. The Yamato symbolized Japan's hope to win through honor and faith. The Iowa symbolized America's belief that progress, not passion, decides the future. And when their paths finally crossed, it would not be in a majestic duel of cannons and courage, but in a clash of worlds, one ancient, one modern, where only one would emerge from the smoke. By 1944, the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard for empires. What had begun as a contest of ships and sailors had turned into a new kind of war, one fought across the sky. The Japanese still clung to their dream of a decisive surface battle, where the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi would meet the U.S. Navy in a final duel of giants. But that world no longer existed. The sea was now ruled by carriers, radar, and aircraft that could strike hundreds of miles away. The Yamato was still magnificent, a mountain of steel and power, but she was already a relic of a vanished age. In October 1944, the Empire of Japan made its last desperate bid to turn the tide. The Allies had landed in the Philippines, threatening to cut Japan off from the vital oil fields of Southeast Asia. To stop them, the Imperial Navy launched Operation Shogo, a complex counterattack that would bring its remaining ships, including Yamato, into what became the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in human history. The Yamato, sailing as the flagship of Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, represented the heart of Japan's final hope. Her guns could hurl shells the size of small cars farther than any other warship. Her armor could shrug off even 16-inch fire from the Iowa. Japanese officers believed she could smash through the American fleet and slaughter the invasion forces before they could secure the beaches. But the Americans had something Yamato could not defend against: the sky itself. As Yamato steamed toward the Philippine Sea, she was spotted by U.S. reconnaissance aircraft. Within hours, American carrier groups launched wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes. What followed was not a duel of equals, but an autopsy of an obsolete philosophy. At dawn on October 24, the Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, became the first to feel the full fury of American air power. In a 6-hour assault, 259 aircraft from the carriers Essex, Intrepid, and Lexington tore her apart with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. She sank in the Sibuyan Sea, taking more than 1,000 men with her. The Yamato survived that day, but the lesson was clear: the age of the battleship was over. From that moment on, the mightiest warships on Earth were no longer safe from a single aircraft. A weapon that once symbolized divine power was now helpless beneath the clouds. Meanwhile, far to the east, the U.S. Navy's Iowa-class ships were rewriting the rules of naval warfare. Their radar systems and speed allowed them to coordinate with carrier task forces in ways the Japanese could not even comprehend. USS Iowa and USS New Jersey screened carriers, directed aircraft, and bombarded island fortifications with mathematical precision. Their Mark 13 radar could track enemy planes 40 miles away. Their fire control computers could plot firing solutions within seconds. Where Yamato relied on human instinct and courage, Iowa relied on data and coordination. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, one that blended man and machine. During the chaos of Leyte Gulf, Yamato fired her massive guns for the first time in anger. On the morning of October 24th, she engaged the U.S. escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy 3 near Samar. The battle that followed was one of the most desperate and heroic actions of the war. As Yamato and her escorts opened fire, 5-inch shells from American destroyers screamed back in defiance. Tiny ships like USS Johnston and USS Howell charged headlong into the teeth of the Japanese line, laying smoke and launching torpedoes in suicidal counterattacks. Against all odds, they turned Kurita's fleet back. The Japanese admiral, convinced he was facing a much larger force, retreated, and with him, Japan's last chance at naval victory vanished beneath the waves. When the smoke cleared, Yamato had survived again, but at a terrible cost. The Musashi was gone, the Zukaku sunk, and hundreds of planes destroyed. Japan's navy, once the pride of the Pacific, was now crippled beyond repair. For Yamato, survival no longer meant power. She had become a monument to the past, a weapon without a purpose in a war that had moved on. Back in the United States, the Iowa-class ships stood as symbols of industrial mastery. Each one represented the power of an entire continent mobilized for war. The Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin formed the iron backbone of Task Force 58, the most advanced naval force ever assembled. They could steam thousands of miles without refueling, maintain radar locks in storms, and coordinate bombardments through encrypted radio networks. They were living proof that America had not only matched Japan's engineering prowess, but surpassed it entirely. As 1944 drew to a close, the Pacific was no longer a place of duels and honor. It was a battlefield of machines, carriers, bombers, radar, and logistics. The Yamato and the Iowa had been born from two very different dreams, but only one would survive the new reality. In Tokyo, the Admiralty still clung to the myth of the decisive battle. They refused to accept that their masterpiece had no place in modern war. In Washington, however, American officers were already planning for the future, a future where information, coordination, and air superiority would define victory. The Yamato had been built to terrify. But as the war marched toward its final burning act, it was the Iowa, smaller, faster, and smarter, that now stood as the true ruler of the sea. By the spring of 1945, the Empire of Japan was dying. The once proud navy that had ruled the Pacific now lay shattered, its carriers sunk, its airfields bombed, and its harbors silent. American forces had closed the ring, from Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, and the rising sun was fading behind smoke and ruin. Yet in the depths of this collapse, Japan's leaders clung to a final symbol of defiance, the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, still floated in Kure Harbor, untouched, majestic, and obsolete. She was a relic of another era, but to Japan, she was still the embodiment of the nation's soul. In late March, as American forces began their assault on Okinawa, Japan's high command conceived a desperate plan, one more act of suicidal glory they called Operation Tengo, Heavenly Operation. The mission was simple and insane. Yamato, escorted by a handful of destroyers, would sail from Japan to Okinawa with barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. She would beach herself on the island's shore and fight as a stationary fortress, her 18-inch guns defending the homeland to the last shell. It was a suicide mission not just for the crew, but for the very idea of the Imperial Navy. On April 6, 1945, Yamato's crew of 3,300 men received their orders. Many were teenagers, few expected to return. Captain Kosaku Ariga, the ship's commanding officer, addressed them over the loudspeakers. "Men of the Yamato, our country is in peril. We are to sail against the enemy and die with honor." In the engine rooms, sailors wept as they tightened bolts and polished brass one last time. In the galleys, cooks prepared a final meal of rice and pickled vegetables. Every man understood this was not a mission of war, but of sacrifice. At dawn on April 7th, Yamato left Tokiyama Harbor, her gray hull gleaming under a pale sky. She was still magnificent, her decks bristling with anti-aircraft guns, her ensign snapping proudly in the wind. But as she steamed south through the inland sea, American reconnaissance aircraft were already shadowing her. The U.S. Navy had intercepted radio traffic and knew exactly where she was going. Waiting offshore was the most powerful concentration of carrier air power in history, Task Force 58, with more than 1,000 aircraft at its command. At 12:32 p.m., radar aboard the Essex detected the Japanese force. Minutes later, the first wave of Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers roared into the sky. As they climbed through the clouds, the pilots were briefed. Their target was the Yamato, the pride of Japan, the last giant. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. At 12:45 p.m., the first American planes appeared over the horizon. The Yamato's lookouts shouted warnings as the sky darkened with bombers. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from her decks, filling the air with black bursts and streaks of tracer fire. The ship's gunners fought with desperate precision, but the odds were hopeless. Within minutes, the first torpedoes struck her port side, ripping open compartments and flooding the engine rooms. Bombs rained down on the superstructure, tearing through steel like paper. One by one, the ship's gun turrets fell silent. For nearly 2 hours, the attack continued, relentless, coordinated, devastating. Yamato was hit by at least 10 torpedoes and 13 bombs. Her speed dropped to zero. Fires raged from bow to stern. As seawater flooded her lower decks, the ship began to list sharply to port. Captain Adiga stood on the bridge, refusing to abandon his post. At 2:23 p.m., the order was given to abandon ship. Hundreds of men leapt into the oily sea, only to be swallowed by the blast wave that followed. At 2:23:45 p.m., Yamato's forward magazines detonated. The explosion was apocalyptic. A column of fire and smoke rose over 6,000 feet into the sky. The shock wave shattered nearby destroyers and could be seen from 100 miles away. When the smoke cleared, Japan's mightiest warship was gone. Of her crew, only 276 men survived. More than 3,000 perished, their ship sinking beneath the waves in less than 10 minutes. To the Americans watching from the air, it was a stunning sight, a mountain of steel erupting into oblivion. One pilot later wrote, "It was like watching the death of an empire." To the Japanese, it was the end of an illusion, the death of their faith in invincibility. Yamato, the ship meant to protect the emperor's realm, had instead become his final offering. In Washington, analysts studying the battle noted the cold facts. 386 American aircraft, no ships lost, just 10 planes downed. The contrast was absolute. A single air fleet had destroyed what had once been the most powerful battleship in history. It was the final proof that the age of surface giants was over. The ocean had yielded its throne to the sky. But even in death, Yamato's story carried something deeper than defeat. For the men who died aboard her, there was no bitterness, only duty. Survivors recalled Captain Adiga's last words before the final blast. "Let our deaths be the pillar of Japan." In their minds, the ship's destruction was not a failure, but a purification, a final act of service to a dying empire. For the Americans, the sinking of Yamato was more than a victory. It was vindication, proof that technology, coordination, and overwhelming force could triumph over even the most fanatical courage. In that single moment, the United States had not just sunk a ship, it had buried the last dream of Japanese naval supremacy. The Yamato's explosion marked the end of the battleship age. No warship since has ever been built so large or with such arrogance of purpose. She had been born from pride and perished in inevitability, a monument to both the brilliance and blindness of human ambition.
When the smoke of Okinawa cleared and Japan's cities lay in ruins, the world began to reckon with what had truly ended in those waters south of Kyushu. The sinking of Yamato was not just the death of a ship, it was the funeral of an era. For centuries, naval power had been measured in guns and armor, in displacement and dreadnoughts. But on April 7, 1945, that metric dissolved forever beneath the waves. From that day onward, the sea belonged not to ships, but to the sky. In Tokyo, word of Yamato's destruction spread in whispers. The government tried to suppress the news, fearful of its symbolic power. But even without confirmation, the people understood. The ship they had been told was unsinkable, the divine shield of the emperor himself, had vanished. For many Japanese, that realization, not the atomic bombs months later, was when the war was truly lost. It was the moment faith gave way to reality. For the Americans, Yamato's death was both a triumph and a revelation. The U.S. Navy had not defeated her in a duel of battleships as Mahan's textbooks once envisioned. It had done so with coordination, technology, and mobility, virtues embodied in the fast carrier task forces and in the Iowa-class battleships that supported them. The victory validated a new way of war, one driven by radar networks, logistics chains, and industrial momentum rather than romantic heroism. The Iowa herself would live to see the fruits of that lesson. When USS Missouri, her sister ship, steamed into Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, it was aboard her deck that Japan formally surrendered. In that symbolic moment, the circle closed. The empire that had once built Yamato, the ship designed to rule all others, surrendered beneath the guns of the American battleship that represented the future, fast, precise, and born of industry. But history, in its irony, is never simple. Though the Iowa's victory seemed total, the same logic that doomed Yamato would soon render even the Iowa obsolete. Within a decade, guided missiles and jet aircraft would replace big guns as the arbiters of power. But the Iowa-class ships endured longer than any other battleships in history, not as instruments of domination, but as adaptable symbols. They served through Korea, Vietnam, and even the Cold War, their radar suites upgraded, their guns retooled to fire nuclear shells. Where Yamato had died frozen in time, Iowa evolved. She embodied what the Japanese Empire could never accept, that survival requires change. The strategic meaning of Yamato's fall stretched far beyond Japan's surrender. It was a warning written in steel, that technological arrogance can be as deadly as ignorance. The Yamato was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a floating cathedral of engineering, but she was built for a war that no longer existed. Her designers worshipped armor when the world had already moved on to radar. They built for glory when victory depended on supply chains, and they believed in honor when survival demanded adaptation. Meanwhile, the United States, pragmatic, restless, and industrial, had turned every lesson into progress. Pearl Harbor had been its wound, but it had learned from it. It had built radar to see farther, logistics to move faster, and ships like Iowa to integrate every weapon and sensor into a coherent fighting machine. Yamato fought as a symbol, Iowa fought as a system. That difference was the foundation of modern warfare. When the Cold War began, the two ships' legacies diverged even further. Yamato became a ghost, its wreck discovered decades later under 1,000 feet of water, a shrine to sacrifice and futility. Japanese divers who visited it described a strange reverence. The massive turrets still pointed skyward, as if guarding an empire that no longer existed. In contrast, the Iowa-class ships remained living monuments. USS New Jersey bombarded Korea in the 1950s. Missouri and Wisconsin fired cruise missiles during the Gulf War in the 1990s. Their survival was not nostalgia. It was testament to adaptability, the same quality that won the Pacific. Even in peacetime, their rivalry echoed as a parable. Naval cadets studied Yamato as the ultimate cautionary tale, how pride can blind innovation. Engineers studied Iowa as the blueprint for enduring design. And historians saw in their stories a reflection of two nations' souls, one striving for perfection, the other thriving through reinvention. In Japan, memorials to Yamato still draw crowds. Veterans remember her not as a failure, but as a symbol of devotion, the last stand of a generation that believed honor could conquer reality. In America, the Iowa sits preserved in museums, her decks open to children who walk beneath her immense guns and touch the steel that once faced Yamato's world. To them, she is not a weapon, but a promise, proof that progress, discipline, and unity can overcome even the most impossible odds. Today, under the calm Pacific waters, Yamato sleeps, her hull split, her spirit undimmed. Above those same seas, Iowa still floats in sunlight, her flag unfurled. Together they form the twin bookends of a vanished century, one built on faith, the other on foresight. Their story endures because it asks a question humanity still wrestles with. What is true strength? Is it in the weight of armor or the wisdom to change? Yamato chose pride. Iowa chose progress. And when the final echoes of their guns faded, history made its judgment clear.